generations down, but she was probably a first cousin to like my great-great-grandfather. And she had sort of an interesting life. Again, she was born in Greenfield, Indiana. Her father's line of business was music instrumentation. He repaired music instruments, and they moved from Greenfield to Terre Haute, and that's where she lived most of her younger years. And I recall that her father set up a business in a building, called it the Palace of Music. I love that, the Palace of Music. He repaired all sorts of instruments, did piano repairs, etc. And at an early age, Amalia showed ability to draw, and draw very beautifully. She just seemed to have that inherent ability. She also, of course, grew up in a musical household. Like I said, her father repaired instruments. I think he also composed music. Her brother later went on to become a renowned composer. We'll talk about him a little bit later. So I think she grew up in a very cultured environment, though they weren't terribly rich. I think she had a very rewarding childhood. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is, as I started to research Amalia, and I had heard about her growing up, the only thing that I had heard while my grandmother was still living was that she was a miniature portrait artist, born in Terre Haute, and that she had done Edward VII of England. Again, that would have been Queen Victoria's son. So I just knew that about her. Now, my grandmother did have some miniatures of hers. When you would walk into her apartment, just when you got past the door and the coat closet, there was a beautiful gold cabinet, a miniatures cabinet on the right-hand side, just had all sorts of beautiful things in it. And there was some miniatures in there. And Dick Hester, I know you're on. If you want to go off mute a second, do you remember the Kussner miniatures in that gold cabinet?
I remember them so well. They were absolutely gorgeous, and your grandmother was so proud of those. And she pointed those out to all of us when we came to visit, but they're absolutely spectacular. I remember them so well.
Do you remember, Dick, were there 2 or 3 of them? I know at least one was of a woman. I'm having trouble remembering who they were painted of.
There were 3 of them.
Oh, 3, okay.
I do remember 3, but I can't tell you exactly who they were painted of. I just thought they were so spectacular. The intricate detail and the work on those were phenomenal.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dick. That's great. So yeah, I grew up around them. And at the time she passed away, we decided to sell them. Sometimes you regret these things, later, but I grew up with them and they were just gorgeous. Oh, the other thing that I grew up with, and I don't know if you ever saw that, Dick, supposedly, and this is true, Edward VII gave Amalia at least one piece of jewelry. And I remember seeing that. That also got sold, but I remember seeing that jewelry that was very elegant. So again, that's sort of the background, how I knew about Amalia. And when I started doing research, there was so many wonderful things about Amalia. That became the first of my podcast series. I have a podcast series on Apple now that we'll talk about later. So I've done just a tremendous amount of research this last year. Even in Ancestry.com, I found out interesting things, scanned in newspapers. So those have been my sources, in addition to some nice articles written by some locals from Terre Haute. And let's talk a little bit about, how she sort of came into her own in her career. She did have some artistic training at St. Mary of the Woods Academy, and it wasn't a college then. It was just, I think, a girls' school, I believe, at that time. And one of the sisters there, who was very artistically inclined herself, was Sister Schnell. And she gave Amalia a lot of lessons. And this was in the grade school years. I think a little bit later, when Amalia was in high school, she might have had some lessons from that academy, but mostly when she was very young. And Sister Schnell, I've actually seen some of her artwork. I saw a beautiful sketch she did of a paddle boat on the Wabash. So she, again, was very artistic in her own right. And how she got into miniatures, the story goes that her father gave her a miniature portrait on ivory. And Amalia was fascinated by the technique in doing miniatures. And she started doing miniatures herself. And her brother, I guess because they were in a music repair store, gave her ivory keys. So there might have been, discarded ivory keys from pianos, and she would do artwork even on them. So on and off, she continued some art lessons. When she graduated from high school, she went to what it might have been called a finishing school back in, I think, the late 1870s. And she had further art lessons there. This school happened to be in New York City. And she also learned French and German. She was very fluent in a number of different languages. She started to get so good at her artwork. She came back to Terre Haute. I think she studied under a couple of people in Terre Haute. One of the names was Helen Minshall. Some of you people may know her. She was very involved in the Decorative Arts Society of Terre Haute. But at any rate, her quality started to get so good. She started to sell the miniatures. It became a real business for her. And let's see here, let's go down another slide. Oh, here's a picture of Terre Haute. I just wanted to share this. This was, I guess, an engraving of Terre Haute in 1880. So I like to think of Amalia somewhere in one of those buildings doing her miniatures. I just love this picture. So, and I want to talk just briefly about her brother. Her brother, Albert Kussner, was again a renowned composer. And he had moved to Chicago. I think he lived there with his wife for a while. There was also a publishing company in Chicago that published his music. And if you folks can see right above his composition, Moon Moss, it says to Amalia. So this specific music was dedicated to Amalia. In fact, what you're looking at right now, I have that music. It was given to me by the family, which I really treasure. So this is, I guess, circa, I don't know, 1900 or so, but it's just lovely. And I bring up Chicago because there was quite the clientele. So her brother got her connected with the wealthy of Chicago, and this really upped her price for each of her miniatures and exposed her to a wider variety of clients. So there was a huge turning point for her in 1892. So up to that point, she had her local business in Terre Haute. You know, she had a number of customers. Again, she was getting people out of Chicago, but she sort of wanted to explore her world. I think Amalia, though I think she loved Indiana, she just couldn't stay put. I think she was very adventurous and wanted to go out to New York and see what she could maybe do with her business. Her connection that brought her into New York was, believe it or not, a Broadway actress. I think also a graduate or someone who had gone to St. Mary of the Woods Academy. Her name was Alice Fisher. And in the 1890s, she was a very well-connected actress. Again, she was on Broadway, and she was able to network Amalia with the upper echelon of society in New York City in the 1890s. So, and she arrives at the height of the Gilded Age. For those of you that are familiar with history, the Gilded Age was the age, you know, of the Rockefellers and all the wealth and, you know, wealthy and richy at that time. So the Gilded Age, let's say it started around 1870s. If you look at what was going on in America, there was a huge ramp up of industrial activity and inventions and everything. And there were people who took advantage of that and the business and the dollars that brought in. So again, this was a rapid time of economic, technological, and political transformation in this country. If you look up the Gilded Age in Wikipedia, there's a very nice write-up, which I think is fairly accurate. The term the Gilded Age may have come from Mark Twain, and he described this as a time period where everything glittered on the surface, but there was corruption underneath. You know, some of these industrial magnates weren't always nice people, which probably doesn't surprise you. And these rulers were wealthy tycoons, again, industries. There was railroads, of course, was very big when you think of the railroad networks that expanded in the 1800s, mining, financial, banking interests, et cetera. Again, names like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller. So let's again talk about Amalia in New York City. At this time, New York City was ground zero for the Gilded Age. Anybody who was everybody in the Gilded Age, pretty much it was a lot more New York City than Boston. Boston really wasn't much of a center for this type of crowd. One of the reigning women in the Gilded Age in New York was Mrs. William Astor. And of course, I think a lot of people know the Astors. Obviously, they had those mansions in Newport, etc. Her name was Caroline, but she went by the name of Lena. And she basically assigned herself as the queen of the Gilded Age. And she drafted a list of the who's who of who was accepted in society, who, if you had a party, who should you invite to that party? And the list was just called the 400. That's what it was. It was Mrs. William Astor's list of who's who. And these, again, were the rulers of society. And they viewed themselves as royalty. They truly, truly felt that they were of the level, let's say, of European royalty. And they wanted to be remembered as royalty. And Amalia helped them do that in her miniatures. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key women that Amalia associated with in this upper echelon of society. Mrs. Theodore Havermeyer, now her husband was in the sugar refining business, I'm sure somewhere down the Caribbean, was bringing up sugar and maybe the rum business, etc. And he was also a consul general for New York City. Now, if you can see on the slide right now, that is Mrs. Havermeyer. Look at the dress she's in. If you looked at this briefly, you might think it's Marie Antoinette. Oh, no, no, it's one of the 400 wanting to be royalty, right? And she connected Amalia with a lot of people. She got a lot more commissions, highly paid commissions. So she was a good entree into the society. We're also going to talk about Minnie Paget. Now, a number of you here, I'm sure, were watchers of Downton Abbey, right? And one of the characters, Cora Crowley, was a dollar heiress. And these dollar heiresses, there were a number of these women who had the wealth of America, right? You know, for whatever their family's business was, these women had money. And at the time, some of the ruling elite and the royalty in England, they were on hard economic times over in England. So it was like a perfect match. The women wanted to marry royalty and the royalty wanted their money. So there a lot of these marriages occurred, which again, the fictional character Cora Crowley did bring her money into that family. So Amalia connected with Minnie Paget, and she definitely married into British royalty. She became a lady, I think it was a marquess. I'm not sure what the pecking order is in British royalty, but he did have a title and a castle and the whole 9 yards. All right. So when she actually first got to New York City, and I do want to mention this, she was given a job doing painting at the Tiffany Glass Company. Of course, everybody is aware of the beautiful Tiffany glass, you know, in the late 1800s, of course, going into the 1900s, beautiful, beautiful glass. And for a while, her works were displayed in their window. Well, Amalia being Amalia, I think she felt her career was not progressing fast enough. So of all places, she left Tiffany. But it actually worked out for her. She set up a studio in the Windsor Hotel for at least 6 years. And this studio is where people would go to have their portraits done. Now, in some cases, if you were wealthy enough, she would go to your house or your mansion, but a lot of the portraits were done in the Windsor Hotel. Now, again, we mentioned Mrs. Havermeyer getting Amalia into society. She was able to help Amalia get entered into an art show. Now we're talking 1894 with the National Academy of Design. And of course, the National Academy of Design had many of the great artists at the time, including William Merritt Chase. And I know there are a number of Merritt Chase at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. I think most of the great museums in this country have William Merritt Chase. But these are the type of artists that she was starting to associate with. 10 of her miniatures were on display, and there were all of the notable women of society, probably a lot of them on that 400 list. And this was great exposure for her. And she got, of course, even more business from this show. And this was an incredible marketing approach. And I think Amalia was very well aware of that. All right, here's a picture of Amalia. I know one of you I talked to at the very beginning had this picture. Now just look at her. This is not a retiring Victorian woman, okay? She's sort of hanging it all out there like, here I am beautiful, I am powerful. I just love this. And there's just such a sense of self-assurance coming from her face, the way she's looking. She's got her hand on the hip. I just love this. Here's another photo of her. I love this too. And she's just looking right out, like saying, here I am. I want to talk a little bit about her dress. So if there was a strong breeze in that room, that dress would not be held up. First of all, it's not even a dress. It's like, you know, wraps of tulle and lace and maybe silk flowers. She just threw that thing on. But she wanted to look alluring and provocative, and she certainly did. And the way you see her dressed here is the way she started to address a lot of these women, again, of the 400, the Gilded Age women who wanted to appear almost mythical in nature and, you know, like royalty. So this sort of outfit was very common with a lot of the people that she painted. All right, so here we have Mrs. William Astor. We're going to look at some of her works now. I'll talk about this in a second, but you see how sort of dark and pronounced her eyes were? When people sat for her at the Windsor Hotel, they were in semi-darkness. She had the shades or curtains pulled. So when you're in a darker light, your face is more accentuated and brings out your features. And that's how she wanted to paint people. But notice, you know, the swaths of toile or whatever around her. That's, I don't know if that's a real dress or there's some scarves or whatever around that, but it's beautiful and mysterious and provocative. Again, that was sort of like a key feature of many of Amalia's portraits here. All right, so here we have some women from England. We'll talk in a second, but she did go to England to start or to do some of her work. We have Duchess of Marlborough and Lady Allington. So again, especially in the case of the Duchess of Marlborough, she's just wrapped in toile. And she loved to have women's hair up. That made them look even more regal, you know, with earrings or maybe pearl necklace, but very, very elegant looking women. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about her artistic style and her approach. Now you've got to realize, again, these are miniatures. They're done on ovals that are at most 5 or 6 inches tall. So when you think of the detail and the shading and everything that she does, it's amazing that she is able to do that. Like I've mentioned here, she painted in semi-darkness. She had dim light. In fact, what she had to do in order to do these miniatures, she might have to, you know, move her paintbrush and easel and everything over to a window. So she might crack, you know, the curtain open a little bit so she could see what she was doing, but the people she would be painting would still be in semi-darkness. And she often would have a magnifying glass, which you'll see in a second. We have an enlargement of one of her miniatures, and you can see how fine it is. She had brushes. Some of her brushes individually only had 3 or 6 hairs. So that's how fine that she could draw some of this. And like I said, you know, the women had a magical feel to them. You know, they might have pearl necklaces on, very open, exposed necklines. And I like to think sometimes of Titania, the Queen of the Fairies in Midsummer's Night Dream. Some of the Shakespeare books are illustrated. They look like, some of these people look like Titania. And the men likewise had a mythical grandeur. And this just so suited the people of the Gilded Age because they were basically the royalty of America. They were treated as such and wanted to be remembered that way. All right, let's talk a little bit about the miniatures at the Swope Museum. There are 3 miniatures there, all of the same family. They were the Strong family. It was the father, mother, and the daughter. And I want to give you just a little bit of the background of these people so you understand where they were in society. The father was Charles Hammond Strong, native to Erie, New York. And of course, that was a huge railroad line that went through Erie. And I want to tell you a little bit about his career. Was first president of multiple coal companies, obviously coal being a big industry in the 1880s, 1890s. He was then president of the Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad Company, and he had other business ventures, including electricity and publishing. So to me, he was almost like a lesser version of William Randolph Hearst, who himself was involved in so many different businesses. So this is a fairly big mover and shaker. Mr. Strong married Annie Wainwright Scott in 1881. They had a daughter, Matilda Thora Wainwright Strong. Of course, the rich love having multiple names. 3 names aren't enough. You need to have 4 sometimes. And we'll see all of their portraits here in a minute. I do want to mention when I did a little research on the Strong family, Annie Wainwright Scott Strong was actually a very active philanthropist. She gave money back to the community. She founded Erie's first nursing school, which I think is very admirable. And she was also seen as Erie, New York's social dictator. So she sort of called the shots on parties and events. And these portraits, I'm pretty sure, were done around 1894. And they may have been done at the Strong Mansion. And the reason I say that, because the whole family was done, Amalia might have traveled to their mansion in Erie, New York. Here's a picture of the mansion. I mean, doesn't that speak to you, power and wealth? It's now, I guess, a university called Gannon University, but just look at that. You just imagine the events and the parties that were held there. All right, so now we can see the miniatures. So here we have Charles Hammond Strong. Look at the way his like chin is jutted out. This is a guy of power. You can just tell he's just could take command of things. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I think this is indicative of Amalia's personality, notice where her signature is. It's not down very subtly, maybe down where his coat was. It's right in the middle next to his face. You know, it's almost annoying to me. If I had commissioned this, I don't know if I would wanted the artist's name next to my face, but there it is. That's Amalia, you know. I think she was like really the queen of marketing. I don't even know the term marketing existed then, but she was so good at marketing herself. All right, here we have Amy Wainwright Scott Strong. And look at her. Doesn't this look like a king or a mythical character? I just love this. And again, see Amalia's signature there. It's actually in white here against the background. Now, if you look at her outfit, if you want to call it that, you know, it's like very royal. It's like white mink with ermine. This is a sort of a very typical type of fur that you would see on royalty of Europe. And then it might have been like a satin or a gown that fur was attached to. And without getting too specific, but a little bit of her nudity is exposed here. If you look sort of down to the right, yeah, there's a little exposed there, and that's a very atypical, but I think these people wanted to be maybe a little bit little out there. I think it's just amazing. And she has a very confident expression. She's got her hair up. She's got, you know, the beautiful wrapped around strings of pearls. I'll tell you, if I ever have my painting done, this is how I want to do it. This is my portrait here. All right, and here's the daughter, Matilda Thora Wainwright Strong. When I look at her, she would have been around 12 years old at this time. I get the sense that she was constantly in motion. I could just see Amalia saying to herself, honey, could you sit still? Just looking at her, I think she was moving all the time. But I love, you know, the bow in her hair. Obviously, this was a much more subdued and appropriate portrait for a young girl. Now, what you're going to see next here, and I want to take some time on this, this is an enlargement of the forehead and the hair and the pearls of the mother here. And again, I want to thank the museum for giving me these really nice detailed images that would allow me to zoom in on this. What you're seeing here, it's sort of, let's say it's a square. The size of this wouldn't have been any more than an inch roughly. So just think, if you take your fingers and you maybe want to do an inch here, think how fine the artwork would have been to do her curls and her eyes and the pearls. It's just amazing to me. And you can look at that and you can appreciate the talent that Amalia had. All right, let's talk a little bit about the British Society and a royalty. So we talked earlier about Minnie Paget, and I want to go a little bit more into Minnie Paget's background. She married into royalty, at least like a medium level of royalty. And through her marriage, she actually was brought into the inner circle of those who hung around with Prince of Wales, Edward VII. He was very social. In addition to social, I think he had a couple of mistresses, but he did not lead a low profile life. He was very involved with society and balls and this, that, and the other thing. And Lady Paget was right there in the middle of that social circle, which further got Amalia contacts with royalty all over Europe. It's just amazing. Now, there is evidence that a couple of pieces of jewelry I mentioned at the beginning were given to Amalia. At least one or two pieces came from the Prince of Wales. Again, I think I'd mentioned at the beginning, there was a beautiful diamond necklace. It was actually sort of like a triangle with a suspended emerald. It was absolutely stunning. And then we're going to see a picture of another piece here in a minute. And the other piece you're going to see may have been designed by Renee Lalique, who was most famous for his glass works. So again, through all of these connections, through Lady Paget and the royalty, of course, that associated with Edward VII, she painted other famous royalty and also, businessmen and what have you of Europe. And yeah, so she connects also with royalty in Germany, and she also connects with the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, which is a great story. I'll get into it in a moment. I do want to just sort of digress a little bit. in order to do research, what I like to do if I read about something in an article or a magazine article, I like to get secondary sources to back up what I'm reading about. I actually emailed the Royal Archives of England, and these would have been the archives of British royalty. And I actually connected with a woman who works out of Windsor Castle, believe it or not. And I said, you know, what do you have on Amalia Kussner? And she was a very lovely lady. She responded to me within a week, which is great because I didn't pay her a dime, but she said, I don't know who Amalia Kussner is, and I've never heard of her. And I explained, I said, you know, she had done Edward VII's portrait, maybe some other British royalty. And I said, why don't you check under her married name? And she replied to me a week later and said, no, I just can't find anything about her. Right after I got that second email, I actually found an image of Edward VII and I sent it off to her. So this is one of the points in my podcast series. Sometimes you have these people that have incredible backgrounds, but for one reason or another, they're like buried in history. So even as I'm talking to, you know, these people with Windsor Castle and all the royal archives, they don't know of Amalia or the portrait done by her. Excuse me. So here we have Edward VII. This portrait was done in 1897. Now, I don't know if he actually wore a ruff. When you look at this, you think of somebody like from 1612 or something like that. So I don't know if she embellished this or if he actually wore this outfit, but it's very interesting. It's intriguing to me. And someday I may do a research to see what those medals are. I'm sure those medals have, you know, some sort of meaning. But as you can see at the bottom, HRH, so His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, from the miniature by Amalia Kussner. And it was painted at Marlborough House in July of 1897. So, you know, now they know at Windsor Castle that this thing actually happened, which is great. Alrighty, so talking here about jewelry, what you're going to see, this is actually was an oil painting done of my mother. And this was one of the pieces that might have come from Edward VII. I'm sorry I did not show her whole face. Part of the upper part of the portrait or the painting sort of got messed up, so I wasn't able to take the picture. But you can see it. That might have been one of the pieces that was designed by Renee Lalique. So, I mean, a very elegant piece of jewelry. All right, so I'm going to pause for a moment. If you folks want to go off of mute, if you have any important questions, I'm also going to bring up chat. I want to see if any questions came into the chat here. So we'll have a much longer question and answer at the end, but does anybody have any questions right now or anything that we can follow up on? Any other questions right now, at least? And by the way, I see Karen Zach joined us. Hi, Karen. I'm so glad you're on. That's great. I introduced you. Yeah, one of the great historians of Indiana. Welcome.
I'm sorry, Karen, I had emailed you back, but I don't know where to a Hotmail address, I think.
Well, she got in. That's the important thing.
Yeah, but she's had a problem getting in, so I apologize.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad you're here. Okay, what kind of paint was used on the ivory? Greg Mead asked that. It was, believe it or not, watercolors. And she might have put some sort of finish over that. But it was watercolor, surprisingly, and maybe because of the fineness of her work, oil could not get down to that, you know, miniature type of art technique, possibly. It was always watercolors, though. All right, well, I'll tell you what, if there aren't any other questions, we will continue. And again, oh, wait, I did another question here. Yeah, I will share information on the podcast. Thank you, Shelley, for asking. It's on Apple. The name of the series is People Hidden in History, or you can search on my name, but I'll talk about that more at the end. All right, thanks, folks. So we'll just go on here.
Kathleen, there's one more. How many of the cameos are known to exist?
I believe she did a total of 200, which again is surprising to me that there aren't more in museums. I don't know if any exist in any British museum. If you look outside of America, most of her work second to America was done in Britain, but it was a total of 200. And I would say, this is another interesting point, I would say each miniature took at least a week to do. She might be able to do them faster, but it was at least 7 days for who to do that artwork.
Kathleen, how many do you know where they are?
I said it way at the beginning. In this country, there were only 5 known works that are in museums. There's obviously 3 at the Swope. There's one at the Cleveland Art Institute, and there's one at the Worcester Art Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts. That's all I know of in museums right now.
Do you
Again,
know anybody in private collections that have them?
I suspect you're right. I think there probably are collectors of these, maybe, because they're a family, they might have been held on to. And the funny thing is, I actually have my email into some auction houses. I haven't seen any come up in the last year. So it is a little bit of a mystery as to where all of these are. That was a good question. All right, let's talk about 1899. That was really, to me, her premier year, if you will. All right. So as mentioned, she's got connections through the British Royal Circle, and her notoriety went out to the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, Nicholas and Alexandra. And she was invited, actually, initially in March of 1899, to do the Tsar's uncle's wife portrait. So initially, she wasn't going to do the Tsar and Tsarina. It was a relative that had invited her out there. And then later in 1899, she did Cecil Rhodes, again, who was the, diamond magnate, if you will, of South Africa. And she traveled down there. So again, 1899, there's like a mini series on this year alone. Okay, so let's talk about her visit to Russia. Like I had mentioned, she was first invited by the Grand Duchess Maria, wife of Duke Vladimir. I love that name, Vladimir, and he was uncle to Tsar Nicholas. And the story goes, and this is all documented, I would just want to skip ahead here a little bit. She wrote a detailed article of her visit to Russia. And a lot of the details that I'm going to talk about here come from that article. And that article is actually online. It's scanned in, I think, in Google Books. And I'll tell you later how to find it. But a lot of these details are in that article that she published in 1906. And just amazing details. You sort of feel like you're right there with the Tsar and Tsarina. So in the article, she writes of going to Duchess Maria's home. She's about to start to do the artwork, and a royal messenger comes in and says to Amalia, "You have been summoned to the Winter Palace." So she immediately leaves the Duchess and goes on to do portraits of Nicholas and Alexandra. And in her writing, she clearly becomes friends with the Tsar and Tsarina, with their children. It becomes a very intimate relationship, which is amazing to me. It really is, because I think as you look historically, I think Amalia might be the only one of the few people who recounts being close to these people. I mean, obviously there was a lot of political intrigue, and we know sadly, how their lives ended. But I think Amalia might be the only portrait of her writing of what their lives were like. And the name of the article, which is sort of ironic, is The Human Side of the Tsar. She tried to paint a very positive picture of him. Now, I think we all know there was a lot of political strife. I don't know that Nicholas was really that suited to be a leader. I don't even know if he wanted to be a czar. I think, the lower classes were not attended to. I mean, there was a lot of strife that obviously lent itself to the revolution later. But in Amalia's perspective, these were wonderful people. So you want to take her perspective with a grain of salt. One of the things she says, which was fascinating to me, is everybody in the Romanov family spoke English, which was very, very surprising. So she was able to converse with everybody, and she became close enough that she bought the daughter's presents before she left in that visit in March of 1899. And she met directly with the Tsar, and she did portraits of both the Tsar and Tsarina. I want to talk a little bit about what the family was composed of in 1899. I think when we think of Nicholas and Alexandra, the first name that comes to mind is Anastasia, obviously, and all, the stories that she might have survived the execution, which it turns out she didn't. But when Amalia was there in 1899, only 2 of the daughters were born. It was Olga and Tatiana. And actually, Alexandra was pregnant with Maria that was to be born about 3 months later, but that's never mentioned in the article. And the Tsarina was a very tall, statuesque woman, so she could have been 5 months pregnant, and nobody would have noticed in the clothing of that time. And Anastasia was not born until 1901. And then the one son, Alexei, was born in 1904. Of course, he was the one who was the hemophiliac. So Amalia has this incredible conversation with the Tsar, and the Tsar kept up with American history. He evidently had American newspapers shipped out to him. So he was very worldly about what was going on. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that Alexandra was a very private woman. She was also, by the way, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. Some of you may know that, but she was, connected with the English royalty. And there were very few photos of Alexandra. So when Amalia went there and did the portrait, she also took photographs that are in this article. So she sort of exposed Alexandra to the world, which I think is interesting. All right. Now, here's a really funny thing. Nowadays, when we think of Russia, we think if you visited there, you'd probably be spied on. You may not have privacy. Maybe your hotel room would be bugged. I mean, this is true. This happens. Well, in 1899, Amalia was tailed by the police. All right. So she takes a carriage over to the castle, and she notices there's like a carriage behind her. It's a little bit odd. She gets in, and she says to somebody, she said, I think maybe I was followed. What's going on here? And they said, well, of course you are. You're coming to visit the Tsar and Tsarina, get a reality check, And in fact, one of the guards or one of the police met with her later, and he said, I hope you enjoyed the hat you bought today in St. Petersburg. So they already knew what everything she did that day was amazing. And what they said to her was, if you deviated anything in your daily routine, or if we saw you meeting with people that were suspicious, we would have to immediately report this to the Tsar. So I think it's very interesting. Okay, there's Tsar Nicholas. He was a handsome man. I think he himself might have had a blood relation to English royalty. I forgot how. Maybe one of you can tell me later, but I think there was some relationship between him and the gentleman, I think George V. I think they were somehow distant related, but he was a very handsome man, clearly. All right, here's Alexandra. And there was sort of a shyness about her, as you can see, because her eyes are sort of downcast, but she was beautiful also. Yeah, it's a great portrait there. All right, let's talk about South Africa. So Amalia returns to London. So let me just give some background, what Amalia was doing geographically. By the late 1890s, so much of her business was in England. She effectively sort of moved over there. So I think she gave up her rooms and her studios in New York City, and she was pretty much living in London at this point. So when she came back from Russia, it was to England, and then she traveled England to South Africa. So the reality of why she went to see Cecil Rhodes, she was not invited to do his portrait. I've done a fair amount of research, and she literally showed up his doorstep uninvited. Amalia had a booklet of famous people, and all the people that, were the who's who of the Gilded Age, she wanted to do portraits of, and she always had wanted to do Cecil Rhodes, and she was going to do it no matter what. And this is the other amazing thing. She travels down to South Africa during the Boer War. And the Boer War actually raged for about 20 years. This was like Boer War number 2, the latter of the wars. And again, this conflict went over at least 20 years. Very briefly, what the Boer War conflicts were, it was between the Dutch, who would, of course, colonize South Africa, local settlers, and the British. So who was to rule this land? And things got more contentious when they found, the diamond mines down there, gold mines too, for that matter. So there was a land grab going on between the Dutch and the British, basically. So she gets into Cape Town, and she takes a train going to the Kimberley compound, again, where the diamond mines were in Cecil Rhodes. And she travels with a woman by the name of Nancy Houston Banks. Nancy Banks was a friend of Amalia. She was a journalist, a famous journalist at the time. And in fact, Nancy Banks had done an article on Amalia maybe about 4 years before this. So they were friends in New York City, and I guess stayed in touch over the years. So they're on this train together. They're traveling up to Kimberley, And the Boers, who I think were the Dutch, actually stopped the war, the train rather, and we're going to have everybody to get off, but they inspected everybody on the train, and they seemed to be non-combatants. There was nobody military on this train, so they let the train proceed up to Kimberley. So that must have been very dramatic in and of itself. So Amalia arrives at the Kimberley compound, and Rhodes reluctantly allows her in. And of course, Nancy Banks goes in with her. So by the time she arrives there, the war is in progress. And shortly after they're allowed to go into the Kimberley compound, the fighting gets to a point, they now become prisoners of the compound. In fact, food runs short, it gets very intense. It's basically a real war that she's a part of now. But somehow Amalia gets Rhodes to sit for her every morning. So amongst the shelling and everything, she's doing her artwork in the morning, which is just amazing. And let me go up, sorry about that. And the story goes that while the shelling was going on, Rhodes would walk around the embankments. You know, they had these tall embankments where they were, you know, doing the fighting and the shooting and all this stuff. And he would go and give speeches of encouragement to the British forces and also the locals who were fighting against the Boers. Well, Amalia and Mrs. Banks would go with him, and sometimes they would pick up and inspect shell fragments. Oh, look, this must have bombed here last night or exploded here last night. So they were just amazing women to go through this and not want to leave. Rhodes' life actually became at risk. The Boers definitely wanted to capture and kill him because he was sort of the local leader. Somehow Rhodes escapes and leaves Amalia and Mrs. Banks there. They're probably there another week. And somehow this local fighting, at least in this area, calms down. They're able to leave and go back to Europe. And Amalia finishes his portrait from memory when she gets back to London. I would love to know where that portrait is. I've done research. I don't know if it got lost. I don't know if a family has it, but it'd be interesting to find that portrait sometime. All right. Let's talk a little bit about her personal life. And also, as you saw in the early photos, she was a beautiful woman. I don't think she was more than 5'1". She had luscious, you know, brunette hair, hazel eyes, a gorgeous complexion, obviously an outgoing personality. And on one of her earlier trips to Europe, she meets a gentleman by the name of Charles Dupont Codeire. I would say around 1896. I believe she might have met him in Paris. Codeire is the only son of a very wealthy family who are mostly living in New York at this point, of French heritage. And his father at the time was running a prestigious international law firm called Codeire Brothers. That law firm was in existence in New York, I think at least until the 1990s. It persisted quite a long while. Very briefly, I want to tell you about Charles Codeire's father. He came over from France, and in the 1830s or late 1820s, he was part of some sort of elite guard that was protecting the Napoleon relatives. And I guess when Napoleon fell out of power, this elite guard, people wanted to kill them. So this gentleman, Codeire, left on a hasty retreat and set up in New York, and evidently did very well by himself and became a lawyer. So a little after they met, another war started up, Spanish-American War. You know, I have to tell you folks, I'm learning about all these wars. I don't think we ever hear much about the Spanish-American War or the Boer War. I now know at least when they happened. So he joins the Navy and he does his patriotic duty. But as is the case with most wealthy people, when they go into the military, they don't see direct combat, and he didn't. As much as, you know, he nobly said, I went into the war. He served for a while, I think, in a naval office in New York City. He did go to the Philippines where some of this war was being fought, but he ran a commissary, basically a cafeteria. He did not get involved directly in the battle. His involvement in the war lasted for about 2 years. He returns to America about the same time that Amalia is coming back from South Africa. And I read in a newspaper article, he met her at the docks. It must have been a very romantic scene. And they were married in 1900, about 7 months later on July 4th. And you might wonder, you know, did she date anybody else in those years? Interesting thing I found in my research. In a biography on the inventor Nikola Tesla, he expressed interest in her, and she expressed interest in his laboratory and all his inventions. So he was sweet on her. It was actually documented that he was interested with her, in addition to some other women in the Gilded Age. He was in New York City at the time, and I believe this to be factual. I read later that John Jacob Astor was one of the funders, John Jacob Astor IV, of his inventions and his scientific exploration work, etc. So I have a question for people, and you can answer in the chat. I'm going to bring the chat up. What was famous about John Jacob Astor IV on how he died? Does anybody know? I'll wait here to see if somebody has the answer. I'll give a clue. He died in 1912. Is that a big clue? What happened in 1912? Aha, you got it, Mary. Yes, sadly, he died on the Titanic. Yeah, he lost his life on the Titanic. Thank you. Thank you. It was a good answer there. All right. So in any event, you know, aside from maybe Nikola Tesla being interested in her, I don't have any other records of anybody else she was involved with. And I think, so she would have dated Codeire maybe about 4 years before marrying him off and on. Their marriage, by the way, was a very private affair, and only Amalia's and Codeire's mothers were present. Now, I have often wondered about this, but the more I sort of delved into, you know, the Gilded Age and Caroline Astor's list of 400, Amalia, though she was in ways part of the society, she was really a servant to the society. She didn't have the money. She didn't have the background. So, you know, not that she was like a, you know, a servant in one of the mansions, but she was employed by these people. So she really wasn't considered part of the echelon. So this marriage to Codeire might have seemed a little scandalous at the time, which is maybe why it was a very private affair. The ceremony was in the sacristy of St. Patrick's Cathedral, not even, of course, in the main cathedral. And there was a private dinner after at one of the, you know, leading hotels at the time, but no photos I've ever found on her wedding day or anything. It's sort of unfortunate, but I never found photographs. Also, Codeire's family was Catholic, and in that day and age, if you weren't Catholic, you had to convert to Catholicism to marry, and she actually received or had to apply for a special dispensation to marry Codeire. So Codeire had 4 sisters, and they all had various lavish weddings. Some of them married and went back to France, but, you know, no lavish wedding for him. He was to receive a huge inheritance. I think his father passed away in 1898. I'll have to confirm that. But there was a lot of contention with the will going on at the time they were married, and no wealthy family is worth their salt unless you have a contention on a will. That's just so typical. And of course, we're talking about a huge sum of money. It was Codeire's mother that did the will contest, because it was going to be distributed evenly between him and the 4 sisters, and she was to get a stipend, basically an allowance. She said, forget this allowance thing, I want a hunk of the change. It was eventually, I think, resolved in 1903 and 1904, but of course, Codeire got a huge sum of money. Amalia brought a lot of her own money into this marriage, so these people were not hurting for money. After they were married, they went on an extended trip to Europe. And pretty much after this time, she returned very infrequently to this country, and they traveled extensively in Europe. All righty, let me tell you a little secret about Amalia. She lied about her age, right? Yep, we all may do that, but she lied about her age. And it was a little bit of an accident. When she arrived in New York, she was close to 30 years old. And of course, she was born in 1863. She arrives there in 1892. She's close to 30 years old, right? A magazine article was written about her a few years later that listed her as 22 years old. And this long, you know, young ingenue, beautiful ingenue and everything. I think she was savvy enough to know that an artist at 22 is going to be far more interesting than a mature woman of 32. So she kept her age and she kept this ruse. Furthermore, she was almost 10 years older than Codeire, because this was another thing. I don't think he may have never known what her age was, except maybe later when they did legal paperwork. But even on her passport, she lied about her age. And I will show you a fact on that. This is an actual image from Ancestry.com where she lied about her birth date. And she listed her birth date as 1873. You can see her signature. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around, but there's her signature. I saw at least 2 or 3 passport applications on ancestry.com. She lied on every one of them. So it's very interesting. So what happened to her career and her life after her marriage? Doing portraits was far less starting in 1900. She did return to the Tsar and Tsarina, I believe in 1902, and did further portraits. Also, she did some of the daughters at that time that would have been a little bit older. Another thing that might have hurt her business, there were 2 lawsuits in the early 1900s. There was one that we have details on. There was a Mrs. Watney, and I think she was from England. And the story goes that she originally was quoted $200 on a portrait. But Amalia said to her, if this portrait takes longer, or if I have to touch it up, it could go as high as $400, right? Well, the portrait is done. She sends the bill of $400, and Mrs. Watney goes, no, I'm only paying $200. So they do a lawsuit. You know, this is people who have more money. They could probably burn money and not miss it. And they're squabbling over $200. Well, you know, she gets, you know, interrogated, and Mrs. Watney gets interrogated back and forth, back and forth. Well, Amalia eventually won this, and the Watneys had to pay like $830 for the portrait. So that was not the right thing to do. But there was a very mysterious lawsuit, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second, that had closed records. It was talked about in the newspapers, but it was, I'll talk more. I even have a picture of a newspaper article. Because it was so secretive, I don't know if it was an indiscretion. I don't know if they were trying to bilk some money out of the Codeires, you know, creating maybe a fake crime that could have occurred, whatever. We'll never know what that is because they're closed records, and I'll show that in a second. I also suspect later in the 1900s, her vision might have been failing her. When you think of the type of work she did, you know, for 30 years or 20 or 30 years of her life, it could have affected her vision, could have had, you know, some eye conditions where eyes were starting to fail her. And again, as I mentioned, their whole married life, they just traveled through Europe. And she occasionally did, I know, some portraits of German royalty, etc., but she didn't do much work after she married. They never had any children, by the way. And she, you know, again, travels in Europe up until her death in 1932 in Switzerland. So this is the mysterious lawsuit. What I've typed over here is that one of the lawyers said, we hope the public will never know, which leads me to think it was some sort of indiscretion. I've never read anything very negative about Amalia. I don't know, again, if some fake circumstances were created to bilk them out of some money. I don't know if she actually did something, but the court case was settled. And I think that the Kussner Codeires did have to pay out on this lawsuit. It's just very, very odd. All right, let's talk a little bit about how Amalia kept in touch with St. Mary of the Woods Academy. She would write them on occasion. She would send photographs of her work. So I think this school was always a special place in her heart. What you're seeing is a picture from the yearbook in 1916, and I want to read to you what she says at the bottom, which was again printed in this yearbook. When I go to America next, I shall visit the beloved school of my childhood. I shall not recognize it in its present grandeur, but the warm and tender hearts of the dear sisters will be unchanged. I think that's just beautiful. So I just had to share that with you folks. All right, so I didn't go into detail on this, but Amalia was part of a revival of miniatures. Miniatures were very popular, obviously hundreds of years before that. You know, there were miniatures done of, you know, Queen Elizabeth I, many other royalty. When photography started to come out and the technology of photography started to come out 1860s, some of the wealthy would have actually pictures done, daguerreotypes, etc. But there was a revitalization of miniatures in the 1880s and 1890s, and obviously Amalia was part of that. What I want to point out, this was a picture taken from a newspaper article. These are some of her contemporaries. I don't know, I'm not sure offhand who Charlotte Behrens was, but there was another artist Clara McChesney. I think Julie McKay was an actress, but look at the portraits and the way these people are sitting. There is Amalia's picture. Look at that. I love, love it, love it, love it. You have this woman very demurely with this under her chin, and not Amalia. Very, very dominant personality here. So in summary, who she was as a person, she wasn't just a talented artist. She was an ambitious artist. She knew how to sell herself. She knew marketing techniques, and she was at the right time at the right place. She painted, the big names of the Gilded Age to look like royalty. And that was just a perfect marriage between these, rich industrialists, their wives and their children, and Amalia. And, she, I believe, had a very amiable personality. It was documented that she had an ongoing friendship with the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. I think that she couldn't have had the business and the contact she did if she did not have an amiable personality. She must have really been able to connect with people. And I think she could also read people, because it's often written that people's personalities would come out in her portraits. And she commanded great sums for her works, which is amazing, again, for a woman artist of that day and age. Her prices went as high as $4,000. We're talking $4,000 in 1900. I don't know if that would be, $20,000, $30,000 now, but it would certainly be much, much more than $4,000 by today's economic standards. The only negative thing I've ever read about her, one of Charles Dupont Codeire's sisters said that she was a bit of a con artist, and she publicly disliked her. She actually wrote that in an article. I just want to mention something that I'm going to go into in a later podcast. One of Codeire's sister had a very interesting business. She started a lady cigarette business. Do you remember back in the 1970s, the Virginia Slims came out? Well, that was preceded 70 years earlier by Codeire's sister. I've forgotten the brand of the cigarettes, but it was very fashionable and a little bit risque to smoke. Now, unfortunately, Amalia took up smoking, maybe because of this association with the family. She is listed as dying of a lung ailment. It could have been lung cancer. It could have been emphysema, but she was noted as being a very active smoker. So that might have been a bad thing for her. And the other thing too, if you were a woman of ambition back then, that could be seen as outrageous and not appropriate for women of that day and age. So maybe the sister that wrote the negative column on her, maybe just saw her inappropriate, her being so ambitious at that day and age. But she was a courageous woman. She knew she was traveling into the Boer War. She kept on that train going up to Kimberley. She could have turned back and she didn't. But, just very, very interesting. Now, this painting is actually, I own this painting. This was a gift to me by the Wainwright family. Again, I'm descended to her through the Wainwrights. And I just love this. I wish I had one of her miniatures, but this, I think, is some sort of, woodland tree, or something of that nature. And it seems to be in sort of like a vase, sort of an oddly, some sort of clay vase. But what I want to point out to you folks is her signature. I'm going to have that in the next picture. Look at that signature. Look at the dominance of the A and the K. I'm not like a handwriting expert, but this is somebody who knew who she was very rooted in life and a very bold personality. I just had to show that to you folks. All right, so we're coming to the end of this talk, and I want to say a couple of thank yous here. Thank you to the Swope Art Museum and Hilda Andres. You've been great to work with in your promotion, setting this up. We got the link worked out. It was all good. And the miniatures at this time are not on display. I heard from Hilda and your curators. They've been exposed a lot to light over the years. So at this point, they're only viewable upon request. They are watercolors, which I guess have, the possibility of fading with time. But I think that they could be viewed. You probably, Hilda, if somebody wanted to view these, if you could go off a mute, would they maybe put a request in a week ahead? How could people go about doing that?
Yeah, a week ahead will be great if we can schedule it with Edward Trover, our curator. So it's Trover, Trover, and I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, that would be great.
.org. And if there is enough people interested, we can even maybe have a viewing of them. But let me put that in the chat right now.
That would be great. Now, I had mentioned that one of the miniatures is out of the Worcester Art Museum. I've been in touch with them. They actually are redoing their whole miniature art display. There was a gentleman, I've got to look up his name. His last name was Rabbage. You could probably know it better than I, but there was a collector of miniatures in this country, and he donated the 3 miniatures that the Swope has. He also donated a miniature to the Worcester Art Museum. I'm just mentioning him because he was, I guess, the holder of all these miniatures. Did you want to say something, Hilda?
So it says it's a gift of Louis Hoyer Rabbage
That's it, Rabbage, exactly.
in honor of Frances E. Hughes.
Oh, yeah, and I'll just mention her. Frances Hughes was really the local Terre Haute expert on Amalia. She did a tremendous amount of research on Amalia, published a couple of articles. In fact, I sent you a bibliography of the articles, Hilda. She put enough materials together to do a book. I don't think the book was ever published. She sent a draft of the book to my family. I have a draft of that book, but you know, kudos to her. Obviously, she's passed away some time ago, but she did a tremendous amount of research. And I think some of her papers have gone to St. Mary of the Woods Academy. I think they have some of her papers too, which I would love to see someday. And again, when I was researching a year ago, I did get some images and some history from St. Mary of the Woods College. One of the sisters there was very generous with her time. I also want to say a thank you to my family for their patience and tolerating my many hours of research and telling them my husband to go away. Like, I got to do this now. I can't be bothered. But he was very patient over this last year. And if you have, and we're going to have a Q&A in a minute, so we're still going to do that. If you have any questions, I have my email here. I have it on a couple of the other pages. And if you feel so inclined and you'd like to donate to the Swope Art Museum, you would go into their website and there it is. There's the link. I'm sure there's a donation. So if they go into the main link, there must be an indicator to where to go to donate, Hilda.
Yeah, that link takes you right to it, and there's a donate button, just like a straight donate. There are other things about you can donate, like capital campaign, and I think, and like our annual fund, but there's also just a blank donate button.
That would be great, because you were very gracious to have this a free discussion and presentation. I think a lot of museums are hurting because of COVID over the last year. So it'd be great if any of you choose to donate.
Thank you.
And hang on a second here. All right, so very briefly, I told you about the article that Amalia wrote for Century Magazine. It is online, it's in Google Books. I don't know if you folks know this, but the Google people, one of the good things they did, they have scanned thousands, maybe millions of books that are outside of copyright. They're no longer copyrighted, but a lot of books with rich history are in Google Books. So if you go into Google and you just put in Century Magazine, Amalia Kussner, you'll find the online article. There's a lot of rich detail in there I didn't address, and I would recommend seeing that. All right, questions, more questions. Anybody?
Kathy, I was wondering, you said that the miniatures that your family had, they sold.
We sold, yeah.
Do you have any idea? Are they in a museum now?
I don't honestly know, and I think the paperwork that tracked that, I don't know if I have that any longer. I'm hoping they're in a museum or taken care of wherever they are, but that was a good question. How long? Oh, thank you, Chris Sewell. How long did it take you to research Amalia? My most intensive research was in the last year or so, but a year before that is when I found the article in Century Magazine. I don't have it right here. I actually bought the actual Century Magazine issue from 1906. I have that magazine. It's amazing what you can buy off of eBay. And so I would say, I mean, at least a year's worth of research. Give me another question. Oh, on the painting that I own, I'm going to sort of show with my hands. It's about a little bit wider than that. I would say the painting is maybe, I don't know, 3 feet by 2.5 feet. So it's a watercolor too. So are you aware of any more artworks by her? She did miniatures. I know she painted tiles. In fact, my family have some painted tiles that she did. So she didn't just paint on ivory, she painted tiles. Obviously, she painted on this canvas to do the watercolor. Did that answer your question, Fred? I hope so. Oh yes, a question from Lisa. Can you tell us more about the necklace your mother was wearing? That necklace, I'm pretty sure came from Edward VII. It had diamonds and pearls in it. One thing that I will tell you, I believe it was that jewelry, when World War I broke out, it is documented that she took some of the diamonds out of that necklace, sold them, and gave money to World War I relief efforts. So again, I don't know where the necklace went, but I know that whoever has that necklace now, it's got fake diamonds in it. And it was a beautiful piece. And I have a photo from a newspaper. I didn't include that photo because it just wasn't that good, but it was like 2 different strings of diamonds and pearls. It was offset a little bit. It was basically a very classic Edwardian piece of jewelry. Let's see, I'm just checking the chat here. Yes, I do want to visit the museum in Terre Haute. You know, it's funny. I want to do like a museum tour. I just completed a podcast on General Lew Wallace. Okay, who here from Indiana knows General Lew Wallace? Show of hands. Good, good, good. Okay. He's got a museum in Crawfordsville. And I just completed the podcast. It's out on Apple on General Lew Wallace. So I want to go back to Indiana, see the Lew Wallace Museum and study, and also go out to Crawfordsville. That would be a great fun. I'm sorry, to Terre Haute rather. It would be a great tour. That's a good question about the ivory. Obviously, ivory at that time, you know, elephants were not a protected animal. I'm assuming the ivory came out of Africa from the elephant tusks. I am guessing on that. I'm not 100% sure. But, you know, the ivory business was thriving back then. Let's see here. I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. If you don't have access to chat, does anybody want to go off of mute and ask any questions by voice? Anybody? Oh, yes, go ahead. Karen, you want to, Karen Zach? I'm not hearing you.
I have muted it.
Great.
You hear me now?
I do. Hi, Karen.
Hi. From what I read about her, you said something about her personality. She was just a compelling person that everyone fell in love with, except her sister-in-law.
Yeah, there's that one woman. Well, thank you for sharing that because, you know, when you first read a lot of articles about her, they talk about the young ingenue and, you know, how beautiful she is. But the more and more I would read articles, you're right, there was that personality.
Yep.
And again, by evidence of who she made friends with,
Yeah.
she had an engaging, people liked her.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad you added that. Thank you. Oh, that's a really good question from Lisa Langone. You know, I wonder, I've been checking out on some, you know, what do you call it, art sites and that type of thing. I saw one that sold a number of years ago and it sold for only 200. I would think that her, you know, miniatures would sell for more of that. And, you know, it's one of those mysteries in art world. Who knows why something might cost millions of dollars and something's only a couple hundred. Obviously, to me, these should be thousands of dollars, but I've only seen one listed that sold for a couple of hundred.
Wow.
Yeah, it's sort of surprising. I'm hoping, you know, maybe working with the SWOPE and I'm, you know, connecting with the Worcester Art Museum. I would like the American art world to be more aware of Amalia. I think she really needs to be better known. You know, even from a feminist perspective, you know, she was way ahead of her time in terms of what she did as a woman and a businesswoman. A question from Fred in this chat, are all of her cameos signed knowing Amalia? Yes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What time are we at? I don't see a
We're
clock here.
7:20.
Oh, good. We're almost to the end. This is great. I don't have too much. Let me just do the last slide here. So this is just a little bit about me. That's a picture of me taken probably about a year ago. The podcast is People Hidden in History. Let me just talk a little bit about that. There are 3 podcasts out right now. Obviously, Amalia's there, General Lew Wallace, and Governor McNutt, who was governor of Indiana in the 1930s, Paul McNutt. all, sort of interesting Indiana people. Some of the later podcasts, I'm going to, go outside of Indiana. I started with Indiana people because all of these people I heard about growing up. In fact, Paul McNutt, the governor, I was named after his wife, Kathleen McNutt. So anyway, I sort of started with Indiana, but I'm going to be branching out. There's probably going to be a total of maybe 8 to 10 podcasts when all is said and done. So, if you want, go in, connect, you can subscribe to the podcast series. So when new ones come out, they'll come up. And I think I'm going to go on some other podcast avenues, if you will, like Spotify. There are many other systems that host podcasts. I'm going to branch out of Apple, I think, soon. Any other questions or comments? Oh, thank you. Well, this has been great. I'm so glad all of you could attend. My email is there if you have any other questions. Again, my thanks to you, Hilda. And I'm going to try to make it out to Indiana.
It's lovely to hear you talk about her, and you're so passionate, and we're very fortunate to have you here today with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. This has been great.
Wonderful.
Well, she's a fun thing to talk about. I could talk about, as you could gather, all night. And but again, I'm hoping she gets a little bit more prominent in the art world. There needs to be, like a PBS show or a mini series on her. What do you folks think? I think we need to do a Hollywood thing here.
It's fascinating.
Thank you. I think I'm all done. I guess I'm going to sign off now, and you all have a wonderful evening.
We have a question.
Sorry, another question.
How about a Netflix series?
I think we could do that too.
That's all.
Yeah.
Kathleen, if anybody could get that done, I think you could.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll tell you very, very briefly, I have a secondary connection. Who's the gentleman who did Downton Abbey? What's the gentleman who created that series? Anybody know off the top of your head?
Julian.
Fellows. Yeah.
Fellows, yeah.
Fellows, Julian Fellows. At any rate, I'm like 2 connections away from him right now. I won't tell you my source, but I'm hoping to get something about Amalia out to him. Then I'll keep you posted.
Awesome. Great.
Hilda, thank you again.
Thank you all for joining us. And sorry if I messed up with the mess up a little bit some of you had with the.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good
Thanks,
to
Kathleen.
see you.
Night.
Thank you. Great to see everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
God.